We need to talk about Bruno Fernandes. That's what I'm hearing from Manchester United fans this week after one loss against Hull, where, yes, Bruno wasn't the best player and certainly not the best he's ever been, but was not the worst player on the pitch. I think that probably belongs to one of the many other players on the pitch other than Bruno Fernandes, a man who just is coming off winning the PFA Player of the Year award and is somehow being labelled as the biggest issue in Man United's team. I just can't quite understand it, and I can't quite wrap my head around it, that it's not rival fans that are trying to just slate Bruno and get one over on him. It's not, Arsenal fans who are upset about them not winning, having one of their players will not win a PFA Player of the Year award. It's Man United fans who believe this, and I just can't quite understand why. The biggest criticism on Bruno Fernandes is that no midfield will ever work with him, and people are bringing up the onslaught of different midfields that United have had over Bruno Fernandes' about 7 years at the club. None of those players are particularly good in their own right. I think we've seen many players go away. Look at Sofian Amrabat or, McTominay, Fred. McTominay is really the only example of anybody that's had any success outside of the Bruno Fernandes era. And even McTominay is only having that success because he was completely misprofiled by Manchester United, not by Bruno Fernandes. It has nothing to do with Bruno Fernandes. And I think that's the biggest thing for me at the minute. A lot of the criticism and a lot of the blame that is being directed at Bruno Fernandes should have been directed at Manchester United or whoever was managing them at the time, whether it was Solskjaer, whether it was Ten Hag, whether it was Ruben Amorim. There are so many different examples of misguided placement and misguided anger that is being thrown at Bruno Fernandes that has no place to. The reality is Man United would not have even come close to third place if it wasn't for Bruno Fernandes. He broke the assist record, won Premier League Player of the Year, won PFA Player of the Year, won every award there was to win. And United fans are now, after one game, throwing it completely back at him. And I can't understand why. There are some issues, I think, undeniably about Bruno Fernandes. Yes, there have been an onslaught of midfields, but the only time that Man United have really had a midfield that was built properly and actually built with any semblance of success would have been that Casemiro, Menu and Bruno midfield that we saw at the end of last season. And it worked really well despite all the shortcomings of Casemiro. If we'd have had 28-year-old Casemiro, I think that is a genuine league contending midfield. It's got Casemiro, who was one of the best midfielders in his pomp, and Bruno Fernandes, who's having one of the best seasons the Premier League has ever seen, as well as a very, very talented Kobbie Mainoo. We never had that other than, a couple of months at the end of the season where Casemiro finally managed to string a couple of fit games together, but was still nowhere near his best because he wasn't that fit level. And I think the biggest problem that United have had over the years is that no midfield has worked with Bruno Fernandes, not because of Bruno Fernandes, but because of the midfield that has been around Bruno Fernandes. There definitely is an element of Hollywood ball with Bruno Fernandes. I think you can see when he gets frustrated. You see it against Hull, you saw it in the Europa League final against Spurs, and I was even saying, sat next to my dad saying, hey, you can tell Bruno's getting frustrated. He starts to, they say treat the ball like a grenade. I don't think that's entirely fair to Bruno Fernandes. I think he does try and force things a little bit more than he would, and he does take those risks. But when you actually look at Bruno's career at Manchester United in its totality, he's never had a lower passing accuracy than 77.8%, which is fairly respectable, especially for a player who takes as many risks as Bruno Fernandes does. He is not afraid to go and ping the ball over the top of the defence, and that's what makes him so brilliant. I think all the people that are criticising Bruno Fernandes for being risky and playing those ridiculous over the top balls would not be saying those things when they work for Man United, and they were working all of last season, and they have worked for him many times over his career. It's not like he's a completely inefficient passer who can only just hoof the ball up the pitch. I think that's a completely unfair take on Bruno Fernandes, but it's the take that I'm seeing all across social media this week, and I think it's thoroughly ridiculous in a game where we criticize people for just being able to sideways pass the entire time. There are so many people I see complain about Declan Rice or complain about so many different midfields, I think, especially under Gareth Southgate with England, that said, Bruno Fernandes is doing the opposite of what a lot of people want, doing exactly what a lot of people want him to do. There are so many criticisms of players only being able to play sideways passes, not offering any line breaking or real risk taking. The game has become so safe in this kind of Guardiola-esque style of play where people just pass and pass you to death before they finally find an opening. Bruno Fernandes is not afraid to force that gap and make something happen, and that's what I love to watch. That's what made me fall in love with football. It's that chaos ball. He thrives so much in that counter-attacking system because of his risk ability, his ability to ping a pass and to put something where defenders aren't ready for that pass to come, because who in their stable mind would make that type of pass? Who would try and thread that ball through that gap? That's what Bruno Fernandes does, and that's where he has so much success. And so I think to criticize somebody for risk-taking, and then in the same breath, you'll see those same people go, oh, football's so boring now. These midfielders, all they do is pass sideways and they don't really offer anything. You cannot have that opinion at the same time. I think it's completely contrasting. The other thing is that Man United's saviour for many, many years has been Bruno Fernandes. There have been a lot of dark times at Man United, especially over the past couple of seasons. Everything post-Sir Alex Ferguson was one of the worst periods I've seen. And I've seen people complain that he's one of the worst big-name signings since Sir Alex Ferguson. And yet he's had 6 full seasons at Man United, about 6.5 total. He has been the top chance creator in 5 of them. The only one that he wasn't was, I think, 21-22, where Trent Alexander-Arnold, who in his own right is an excellent playmaker, had the most chances created. Bruno Fernandes creates chances and makes things happen for absolute fun. And Man United would be absolutely dead if we didn't have any of those. We wouldn't have finished third last season. We wouldn't have made the Champions League for many seasons. He has been the only redeemable trait about many Man United teams for many, many years. In turn, he's also never had less than 23 GA in a single year, and I think that's a ludicrous stat to hold. He didn't really take any time to settle into the Premier League. He immediately hit the ground running, and he has been a mainstay in Man United, whether it's been created chances, obviously setting up those assists. He's even had a very, very underrated goal output too, and I think he's always good for a penalty, obviously, too, popping up in those big places. Now, he does have his deficiencies. I think I've seen a lot of criticism about his big game ability, and I think while that can be true, there's not been a lot of big games for Man United that Man United haven't won. I think a lot of the time that Man United have their most successes have most of their successes in the big games. I actually think a lot of the times when we faltered have been in the smaller games, or at least the perceived smaller games. Take Hull, for example, past weekend. We struggle to break down those low blocks. We're not up for it. We don't have teams that attack us. When we play poorly, and I think we saw it a lot in the Ruben Amorim system, and then kind of towards the back end of last year, that second half of the season when Michael Carrick came in, the reason he was so successful was because of the counter-attacking style. Teams thought they could just absolutely get at us and destroy us, and that's where we have the most success. So I think Bruno Fernandes actually thrives in those big games, in those games where people come onto us and we're allowed to kind of play that counter-attacking and chaos style. He's not as good in those lower block games, but I really think that Man United just don't have the players for it either. If you look at our front three at the minute, it's Benjamin Sesko, Matheus Cunha, and Bryan Mbeumo. I think Bryan Mbeumo and Matheus Cunha are not either of those players that can really unlock those low blocks. They both either, Cunha wants the ball to feet, and Mbeumo wants to run over the top. Ahmad is kind of the same. Sesko is the really only low block-esque player because he's so big and so tall and so efficient in the air. You can just whip crosses into him and he will succeed. But even still, we saw against Hull that didn't even make a massive difference. So I don't think it's fair to completely criticise Bruno Fernandes for that. I think, again, it's a shortcoming of Man United in general. And I think the problem with Bruno Fernandes is how he's perceived. He doesn't really have a level that people can accept him. People are very overreactionary on both ends. It's either he's the greatest player in the world or he's the worst player in the world and you should never put on a Man United kit. He's kind of compared to Kevin De Bruyne, which I think is a completely unfair standard to be held against. But there's really not many other people that he can be compared to because he is so brilliant. So I think when you compare him to KDB, somebody so good, he's always going to look deficient if he's not having his best game. Who else do you compare him to? I'm not entirely sure, because I think that Bruno Fernandes is on a level of his own in a kind of medium tier where he is so successful in some games, but he obviously has his own deficiencies. So when you compare him up to KDB, I think it's just he's always going to look like a weaker player than he really is. At the end of the day, this has been a complete and utter ridiculous overreaction after one game. He might start to tail off towards the end of the season and maybe next season because he's old. He's 30-something years old now. He's going to start to falter. He's probably hit his peak last season and it's only going to go down. That's not a reason to discredit all of the great work that Bruno Fernandes has done throughout his time at Man United. And I think that after one game against Hull, we cannot just completely turn everything onto Bruno Fernandes. So let me know down below, are there deeper issues at Man United, or is it really Bruno Fernandes who is the problem?